Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first in ASCB's new webinar series. My name is Sedella Blatch. I'm ASCB's Diversity and Professional Development Program Manager, and I'm here to introduce Kevin Wilson. He is our Director of Public Policy and Media Relations, and he's going to talk to us today about life science advocacy, the 5 W's, and 1H. This webinar is recorded, so you will not be able to ask questions live. However, you will be able to hear the question and answer period that was recorded when this webinar originally aired live. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to Kevin or myself, and we're happy to help you. So to give us a little background about Kevin, Kevin has served as ASCB's Director of Public Policy since 2001. Before coming to the ASCB, he spent 15 years on Capitol Hill working in both the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives. As Policy Director at the ASCB, Kevin Wilson watches action in Congress and federal agencies that are of interest to the cell biology community, and then recommends policy positions and advocacy actions. So thank you, Kevin. We're really happy that you're able to share your insights and advice with us. And I think this will be a really informative talk. So I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Kevin now, and he will be able to share his screen to get us started.
Thank you very much, Sedella, for that kind introduction, and thanks everyone for being here this afternoon. I thought I would take a page out of the journalism world and discuss science advocacy, first of all, with 5 W's that are part of any good newspaper story. And then, since it's advocacy, throw in an H for good measure. So let's begin with what science advocacy is. To begin with, I wanted to look back to sort of one of the fathers of life science advocacy, Tom Pollard, to see what he had to say. A few years ago in an article in NBOC, Tom said a couple things that I thought were really important. He said that advocacy, first of all, is important to make sure that the lawmakers adopt sensible policies. But he also said that the objective is to influence the decisions through education and information, and also to do it in a nonpartisan way. Going a little further, the Public Policy Committee's mission statement says that we regularly educate Congress and the administration, talking about the importance of basic biomedical funding and policy. And I also wanted to pull a saying that from my old boss, Senator Claiborne Pell. He always told us that we should let the other guy have your way. And while he was talking about that from a working in Congress point of view and a politics point of view, in a lot of ways, this fits in with what advocacy is. And finally, I look at advocacy as being a translator between different languages, between science and policymakers, between science and the press, and in some ways, most importantly, between science and the public. So before we go any further, let's take a detour for a quick history lesson. Back in the 70s and 80s, FASCB was the science organization that a lot of groups belonged to. They spent a lot of time helping groups to come to consensus about what federal funding should be. But one of the things that they lacked was a good way to communicate that decision. And then in April of 1988, Tom Pollard and the ASCB Council decided to hire a policy staff person for a 1-year experiment. That experiment is still underway, and personally, I'm very pleased to see that I am the 3rd staff member to fill that position. And later in 1990, ASCB and ASBMB decided to join together to hire a lobbyist to bring their message to Congress. They then formed something called what was then called the Joint Steering Committee for Public Policy, probably the worst name for a coalition ever heard of. It has now been changed to the Coalition for Life Sciences. But the goal of the coalition was to, in general, was to help communicate those decisions and actually the goal of the JSCPP was to steer the work of the lobbyist that was hired, and so that's why they came up with that name. Far too often through the years, we would go into a congressional office and say we were with the Joint Steering Committee for Public Policy, and the staffers would go, "For what?" So we realized we had to come up with a better name. So when should you advocate? Well, you should advocate whenever you have time and use however much time you have. If you have a minute while you're waiting for something, make a phone call, send a tweet, write a Facebook post. If you have an hour, you can write a letter, you can write an op-ed, you can go to a local town meeting that a congressman might be having. And finally, if you have a day, take that time to give a tour of your lab and your department. Far too often, elected officials and the public in general, I think, have the wrong view of what a science lab looks like. They probably think that a science lab looks like something they saw on the latest show of CSI. That's not the way what science labs look like. I think that by giving a tour and showing people what things really look like, it will leave a mental image in their mind. And from then on, they'll always think of that lab, of your department, when they hear something about science. And that will go a long way to helping deliver the message and communicating the message. And finally, if you have that day, you can travel to Washington, D.C. and go to Capitol Hill with us. You can go to your state capitol and talk to state elected officials. Why be an advocate? Well, first of all, you as scientists have a compelling story to tell. It's something that a lot of people wish they understood. It's incredibly promising. And I think that by telling it, we will help build that support that we need to. Honestly, if you're funded by federal support, we owe it to the taxpayers to explain our science. They're paying the bill. We need to explain to them. Also, quite honestly, if you don't do it, no one else will. Washington, D.C. and a lot of state capitals are filled with advocates taking care of their issue. If we're not out there for ourselves, no one's going to do it for us. And a lot of times in government and in policy, and in politics, if they don't hear from us, they will think everything's okay. They're used to dealing with squeaky wheels. And finally, believe it or not, it's a lot of fun. I don't think anyone that's gone on a Hill Day with us or has had elected officials into their labs has ever said that it was torture. If for no other reason, you get to spend time with colleagues. It's really fun. So where do you do this advocacy? Well, you could be like the old movie, Dr. Smith Goes to Washington. You could come to Washington, D.C. But to be honest, Washington advocacy in general has been too successful, and Washington offices are flooded with advocacy messages. I saw an analysis a couple of years ago that said that in the period of time between 2001 and 2011, some congressional offices saw 1,000% increase in constituent mail. And as a side note, that congressional offices' staff budgets have not increased since 1976. Now that's important because they're getting bombarded with all of this new information, these new opinions, and they have to figure out how to deal with it. So what they've done is they've developed new technology to handle this flood. And also, don't forget that soon after 9/11, there was an anthrax attack on Capitol Hill, which has made Capitol Hill even more cautious about mail. So they've got this flood of mail, this concern about security, and they have ways to deal with the messages that are helpful to them. So if you sent a letter to Capitol Hill or to your congressperson or senator, you may have been disappointed with the answer that you got back because they may have just gone through looking for a key word, and the minute they see that key word, they push a button and it spits out a generic letter. That's not necessarily because they don't care about what you have to say. It's because they're being bombarded with other opinions too. With all that being said, one thing that we can do is we can turn our attention to local congressional offices where, quite honestly, they have not had that flood of mail and don't have the benefit of all that technology. We can take advantage of that. But, you know, advocacy is not just going to Congress. It's not just going to elected officials. We need to expand the scope of our community of advocates. It's not just scientists. We also have to expand our advocates to include the beneficiaries of science, industry, general public, the patients who might benefit from cures and treatments for diseases. They need to be on board too. So who should advocate? I'm biased. I think everyone should be an advocate. I think scientists at every career stage have something important to offer the advocacy process. Keep in mind that as important as the differences are between grad students and postdocs and early investigators and senior investigators, those mean nothing to elected officials and probably pretty much almost nothing to the general public. You know, in a lot of ways, there are two types of scientists. There are scientists and Nobel laureates. So I think that advocacy needs to be part of what it means to be a scientist. And I also think that senior scientists need to do two things. They need to encourage their students and they need to lead by example. So let's dig into this a little bit better, a little bit more. How should you be an advocate? Well, first of all, again, I think everyone should be a citizen advocate for those issues that they think are important. It's every citizen's responsibility. Again, as citizens, we can spend as much time as possible following government activities because we need to have an informed opinion. We, in a sense, as citizens, need to be an educated employer. It's one thing to have an opinion, but it's more important to have that opinion based on fact, based on things that actually are happening. So what can you do? First, two things: register to vote and then vote, regardless of who you vote for. It's first of all most important that you vote as a citizen. Again, try to be an informed voter. Spend a little bit of time with newspapers, with television, with news of varying degrees, so you're seeing both sides of the coin. You should call elected officials when you have an opinion. You should attend local town hall meetings. And even if you just listen to the discussion, the fact that you're there says something to these elected officials. If you have a question to ask or a comment to add, you can do that too. To the extent that you feel based on your views, participate in political and civic organizations, bringing not just as a citizen, but also as a scientist. And finally, run for office. It doesn't necessarily mean that running for a national office. Run for the PTA, be on the school board, participate in the system. As a citizen advocate, as a scientist advocate, as I've said before, it has to be every scientist's responsibility. You have to share your passion for your work and your excitement about the progress that you're making. The public has to understand why this research is important, and only you can help them do that. And you also have to explain the connection between the NIH, the federal money, and how it supports your research. I don't think that a lot of the public understands that. You can do it you can go to local office visits, as we've said. You can invite elected officials and the public in to see your lab and talk to your department. And also go to local PTAs, civic groups, like the Lions Club or the Rotary Club. attend or host a science cafe. At the ASCB annual meeting, we have something called Ask a Scientist. All of those are opportunities for you to get out and bring your message to a group of, to the public and to people that are not normally going to understand what it is you do. This is vitally important. You can also be a professional advocate. I can say from experience that they are fantastic jobs, but they are not for everyone. For a scientist who wants to get into advocacy as a profession, remember, you get to explain science, but you don't do science. Honestly, there are not a lot of positions like this to find, and finding them can be hard. There are all kinds of different career paths that you can take under the category of being an advocate. Keeping in mind what we've talked about before, you can be a public information officer at an institution that explains what work is being done in that institution. You can work for a scientific journal as a reporter working on those journals that have front matter with news. You can be a science teacher. The NIH and NSF also have very important positions called program officers that work with scientists to help them get their research funded. The NSF works almost entirely using what are called rotators, which are working scientists who take a certain period of time and come to Washington, D.C. and work at the NSF. And then after that time is up, go back to their labs. There are a lot of patient groups that fund research on their own, and they need grant review officers. They need someone who understands the science and the connection to that area of research to figure out what grants they should fund. And also, there's being a policy director for a professional society, probably the best job. But again, those are few and hard to find because people don't leave all that often. So how should you advocate? So the things to remember about professional advocacy are the good, the bad, and the ugly. The work is incredibly rewarding. You get to help set policy that can pave the way for important things to happen. The bad, honestly, you can't be in this for the money. They have long hours and limited recognition. And really the ugly, sometimes you lose for the wrong reason. And even though you think that the effort that you put in on an effort and the cause that you were pushing forward was the right thing, politics doesn't always work on what the right thing is. And that can be really hard. And you need to think about all three of these categories. So let me give you an example of what advocacy looks like. Let's take simple advocacy. There currently is a bill in Congress. The number is HR 70. Its title is the Federal Advisory Committee Act Amendments of 2017. That's a really long title for a bill whose goal is to prohibit partisan-based appointment to federal advisory committees. Every once in a while, one hears a story of being called by somebody in government and suggested that maybe they could serve on this committee or that committee, but in one way or another, sometimes cleverly, sometimes they come right out and ask who you voted for. It's happened before in the federal government. That's not the way these appointments should happen. So this bill was written to do away with those partisan-based appointments. Now, it's a good bill. The unintended consequences are that it would require tons of paperwork for those NIH people who want to participate in study sections. It's tons and reams of paper and a 6-month to a 12-month delay as the NIH goes through reviewing all of this paperwork. This was an unintended consequence. Unfortunately, because of the way the bill was written and details, it passed through the House of Representatives with everyone agreeing that the intended consequence was, perfectly meritorious. And it even went through the first couple steps of the Senate. And it was at that point that people in the life science community saw this bill and realized what these unintended consequences are. So what did we do when we first heard about this? Well, the first thing the ASCB did was we wrote a letter to the majority leader of the Senate and the minority leader of the Senate outlining our concern about this bill. We asked the ASCB leadership, who were going to be in Washington soon for Hill Days, when they were on the Hill, to bring up this bill and express our concern about it. And there's a slight role here for a citizen advocate. I think in a way, a citizen advocate, this is probably too in the weeds, in part because a citizen advocate doesn't understand the concept of a study section. I think we were successful in stopping the progress of the bill and hoping that the bill will be rewritten to solve these problems. That's a really successful advocacy effort. So let's look at some real complicated advocacy. And it's the federal funding for embryonic stem cell research. Way back in 1995, there was a provision added into the NIH funding bills that said that federally funded research couldn't be used for research in which human embryos or embryos are destroyed. It's called the Dickey-Wicker Amendment. It's in the bill, in every bill every year. Soon after that amendment was first added, Dr. Jamie Thompson published his paper saying that he had essentially found embryonic stem cells. Then in 1999, a year later, actually it was only a few months later, the Department of Health and Human Services gave a legal ruling that said that these cells are, quote, such cells are not a human embryo. And that question was, did Dickey-Wicker apply? And then in 2001, in President Bush's first speech to the nation, and it turned out to be about embryonic stem cells, he concluded that what he was going to do is he was going to allow federal funding to be used for stem cell lines that already existed. That started in 2001, about a 12 or 13 year effort on the part of the scientific community, research institutions, patient groups, to solve this problem and to let science move forward. The professional advocates, ASCB and others, created a coalition, the Coalition for the Advancement of Medical Research. That coalition's main only purpose was to address the issue of federal funding of human embryonic stem cells. We would do things like, ASCB was part of that, I was part of that. We would conduct what are called whip counts, going around to people on Capitol Hill, asking them whether they support this, would they vote for this bill. We even helped review legislation that members of Congress would give us. That's what the professional advocate was able to do. The scientist advocate in this particular case was critically important. We were able to bring scientists to Washington, D.C. and allow them to talk about the promise and the potential of the research if the government allowed it to be funded. The interesting thing about this as an advocacy issue is that this is something that, despite it being complicated, the citizen advocates were able to get involved. The patient advocate community played a huge role. This was, at the end of all of this, this was something that was most important to them, even if they knew that the research was not going to benefit them, but would later on benefit the next generation with this particular disease. And actually, because this debate took so long and was out in the public, in the news so long, the public began to understand what stem cells were and began to weigh in with what they thought should happen. It was, in many ways, even though it's complicated, it's in many ways a perfect example about what life science policy and life science policy advocacy should be. So that's how you can do the different types of advocacy. Let me tell you my path to advocacy. I started with Senator Claiborne Pell from Rhode Island. I was an intern in his office for 3 years while I was in college. When I got out of college, I had a job working for the Senate doorkeeper. I did that for 2 years. That's a job. It allowed me to get my foot in the door, is the short way to explain it. And then I moved to Senator Pell's personal office, and I was what's called a legislative correspondent for 5 years. And that's one of the people that writes all the mail that comes in. And I had a small number of issues, and I had to answer all the mail on that. After that 5 years, I became a legislative assistant. Legislative assistants are the ones are the staffers on Capitol Hill who are responsible for all of the work and all of the issues. I had a small number of issues. I had to know everything about those issues. I had to be prepared at any moment. I had to write the amendments on those issues. I had to write bills about them. And I did that for 6 years. And then in 1997, Senator Pell retired after about 36 years in the Senate. When he retired, I went over to the House of Representatives and worked for a freshman member of Congress, also from Rhode Island, Congressman Bob Wagan, and I was his legislative director. Legislative directors are the ones that oversee the legislative assistants. Their job is to make sure that there is continuity throughout all of the various policy issues that a congressional or Senate office needs to undertake. It's important to make sure that the defense guy and the telecommunications person aren't taking positions that are contrary to each other. And that's essentially what the legislative director does. Congressman Wagan ran for the Senate in 2000, and we lost. And so that means I got to come to the ASCB, and I came to the ASCB in May of 2001, and I've been here ever since. And it was the best thing that ever happened. So that's my path. What's your path to advocacy? You need to find something where your head and your heart are on the same page. You can't think that I should become a professional advocate because it's going to pay the bills, but your heart can't be in it. That can't work. Remember, it's possible to do science and do advocacy at the same time. You don't have to leave the lab to be an advocate. So the first question is, where is your passion? Because if you're not, my opinion, if you're not passionate about what you do, it's a miserable job. And also, once you figure out where that space is, what you've got to do, as with any other job search, is to match the skills you have with their needs. And if you can do that, then you find the perfect job. So how do you start this process? Again, where is your head? Where are your head and heart? What speaks to you? If science really speaks to you, then that's what you do. And in a lot of cases, it's all about opening doors. So again, you're gonna have to match your skills with their needs. What is it that makes you unique? What is it that you know that they don't know? Honestly, who do you know? Do you know someone that can maybe put a good word in for you at a particular place? It doesn't hurt. And then in some ways, you need to convince them that what it is that they're doing, they absolutely need you. And you need to be willing to fight for it. If it's that important to you, you got to be willing to fight for it. So I wanted to, on this last page, just put several references, several websites of places that you can look at. The first one, make sure you to vote and confirm or change your registration. There's a website right there where you can do it. You can do it right from your computer. You don't even have to go down to City Hall. In some cases, I mean, you get everything taken care of without having to go down to City Hall. The ASCB has what we call an advocacy toolbox that has all kinds of one-pagers, 1.5 pagers about how to do all kinds of different advocacy activities. There's the National Association of Science Writers. Apparently, for those interested in becoming science writers, the University of California, Santa Cruz has a fantastic science communication program. There are AAAS fellowships. You can look for government jobs, because government, being an advocate, doesn't necessarily mean just working in Congress. It can be working in the administration. It can be working at NIH as a program officer. Don't discount the role of teaching. We need to make sure that the next generation, my opinion, we need to make sure the next generation understands science and is supportive of science. It's just too cool for them not to appreciate it. And so thank you very much. And now it's time for questions.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I found that really interesting and informative, and maybe a little bit eye-opening, actually. So that was really helpful. So to everyone, please feel free to type questions in the chat box. I went ahead and wrote that reminder for you. Again, if you hover to the bottom of your screen, you should see the word chat with a bubble icon. And if you have questions for Kevin, please go ahead and enter them there. I actually have a couple to get us started while we're waiting for anyone else to add a question. So, Kevin, you mentioned that one of the best things we can do is closely follow government activities and news. So, in today's fake news society, what kind of suggestions do you have that where we can make sure we're getting reliable information about the happenings of the federal government?
Well, I understand that it takes a lot of time, and that in the current environment, it is difficult. But I think newspapers, reading all the way through a story will help explain things. Just reading the first paragraph or the headline doesn't work. You need to spend a little time reading a couple different stories. If you know that a media outlet is sort of tilted in one direction or another, try listening to both. Hopefully in there someplace is the middle ground, or is something that you think that will make you feel more confident. It's, again, a lot of this is about time. It's how much time do you have? And you can continue to dig deeper depending on how much you want to do. But I think the most important thing is not to stick to one source, because you're not going to, you will get it may not be fake, but you certainly will get a bit of a bias. I think that's probably the most important thing to think about.
Okay, great. That makes sense. Thank you. Another question I have, again, while we wait for other questions to appear. So let's say, I'm deciding I want to remain being a scientist. I don't want to do advocacy as a full-time position, but I still want to contribute. And because I really enjoy, doing science and sharing that with others, maybe I want to do something brand new, or maybe grassroots in my local community, maybe with a K through 12 school or something like that. Maybe, or with the public in kind of a science cafe or something like that. Do you have suggestions or ideas as for how people can get started in that realm? Should they call up places and see what they may be interested in? Should they offer ideas of ways they can put on activities? Or what do you think people like that could do?
Well, the first thing I think is the chances are, well, you don't need to worry about reinventing or creating something new. There are, especially with the societies that people belong to, a lot of the groups have already done these sorts of things. There's someone that's done them. So reach out and find out how they did it. And while you don't want to copy exactly what they did, at least it should hopefully give you a framework, and then you can make it your own. I think the next thing to do is to reach out to wherever you want to go and find out, go to the local school, elementary school, and say to the science teachers or the principal, hey, listen, I've got this skill. I would like to come in and talk. How can I help? What can I do? I think and then figuring out what they need, and then taking what you've learned and building your own thing, I think is, in those particular areas, I think that's what's most important. But don't try to reinvent the wheel. Try to look at what other people have done, and then make it, then twist it and make it unique for what you want to do.
Okay, great. And that actually reminds me, if people are interested in doing kind of outreach activities, ASCB, we have public engagement grants that people can apply for, as well as smaller sums in our outreach grants administered by our Compass Committee. So those might be places for people to get started as well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think the work that Compass does, just Compass alone, the large number of ideas and experiences that the members of Compass have should be a great place and an important place to go to get ideas and suggestions. And the ASCB staff, to the extent that we've done these sorts of things before, we're all more than happy to help members out.
Great, thank you. But on the other hand, let's say I'm someone who, maybe I'm a postdoc or a student, and I've decided I would like a full-time career and in advocacy. And I know you listed several resources, websites that we can refer to, but in terms of finding full-time positions, do you think that there's kind of one special or place to look, or would one kind of generally search job sites like USA Jobs for federal jobs, for instance, or Glassdoor, Indeed, or looking at higher ed websites or different universities? How hard are these jobs to basically find on the internet, or do you really have to just know people and kind of get in through those hidden back doors?
I don't think there's an exact answer. I think a lot of it depends on the precise type of professional advocate that you want to be. If, for example, you wanted to be a program officer at the NIH, that's, working with the government, through the government employment system, even just, talking to a current program officer who may be able to give advice. I think if you want to get involved in any advocacy efforts and policy efforts that are political in nature, the good thing about that is, obviously, my biased opinion is they're great jobs, but they're hard to get, and I think it requires putting in a lot of work in advance. I think the easy thing to say is, if you think you want to be involved in an elected office and working in an elected office, the place to start is find a candidate you believe in and work on their campaign. Because really what a lot of elected officials want to know is, they want to know your level of dedication to them and to their cause. And the best way to show that is to spend a lot of time doing something for free. And that will show them that you're really dedicated. And that's sort of how it begins. But then, a lot of these jobs, and then if you look over at the patient advocacy community, I think it's probably just going to those individual websites, checking with people, connected with those societies, asking them what they know, looking at their job boards. There's no one single place. There's no, as far as I know, there's no advocacyjobs.com that will help you out. But you just have to put a lot of time in. That's why the most important thing is to really try to have a really good idea of what it is you want to do.
Great. Okay, that makes sense. For our attendees, does anyone have questions for Kevin? Please feel free to put them in the chat box now and take advantage of his expertise. So, You mentioned, Kevin, that one way to get involved is volunteer to work on a campaign. So is that something people can do in their spare time? It seems like it could be kind of a big commitment. Is that something you think people can take on when they already have a demanding job?
Well, again, yeah, the short answer is yes. In a lot of ways, it's as much time as you have to give. And it's everything from you start out stuffing envelopes, making phone calls, knocking on doors, handing out leaflets. It's not the it's not the exciting stuff, but you need to start building connections there. If you're working for a Senate campaign or a House of Representatives campaign, there over time there may be the call. They may say, "Oh, you're a scientist here," regardless of what kind of science. Regardless if you're a cell biologist, here's some stuff on global warming. Can you answer it for us? Again, because I don't see the difference between scientists. But then you can start to add a little bit more. But it's something that has to be done slowly but surely. You have to prove yourself. But I can tell you that in the member of Congress's office I went to work in, Congressman Wagon's office, we had almost the entire Washington staff worked on his campaign. And so putting that time in and showing that dedication and that you're on board really can pay off.
Wow. Okay, great. And that might also be a way to kind of give yourself a perspective of whether you really want that kind of full-time career, if you really want to dig in that way, perhaps.
Yeah, because if you're working in national politics on Capitol Hill, there are very, very few offices that just have a person that handles science. Very few. If you're going to be the scientist in the office, you might also do health-related issues, which means you would do Medicare, Medicaid. You might handle elderly issues, women's issues. All the stuff gets clumped together. Some hard scientists might do communications and transportation. So you have to be willing to do a whole lot of stuff that's not why you got your PhD.
Gotcha. Okay, that's good to know. It's helpful. So Kevin, we have a question. How do you counter framing? For example, the pro-life movement means if you disagree, you're classified as anti-life.
Yeah, well, so that's, I wouldn't necessarily call it framing, but that's what I mean by you've got to find out whose views you are, whose values work with yours. Because in part, you need to be able to speak for that elected official. That's what it means to be a legislative assistant or on a legislative staff. I had to spend my time, that 5 years, learning what the senator thought before I could, and it was a process to learn, to know on my own, well, this is what the senator thinks. In part because the first person he's going to turn to for advice on what he thinks on a new issue would be me. I mean, and that's the way it works. And it's also important because you are not going to do just one issue. But yeah, I mean, and obviously the pro-life and pro-choice movements it's hard to find crossover there. That politically, those are very powerful positions right now. Probably always have been, right? And you need to, first of all, be able to, you need to ask yourself, okay, this is all these things that this candidate believes in. Am I comfortable with her beliefs? And can I be willing to not just defend them, but am I comfortable with them? So yeah, I don't think it's a case of countering the framing. I think you got to go where, you have to go in the direction of where you agree.
Okay, thank you. Do you think, to follow up on that, are there ways in interacting with the broader public that, we should, any tips for framing, I guess, framing from other perspectives or anything like that?
Well, I mean, so the thing is, if you take that question and move it outside of politics, it changes. So, for example, here, as a policy director of the ASCB, there are just issues that we're only a certain set of issues that we address. And those are issues that are important to cell biologists. So pro-life, pro-choice issues, while in some cases are connected with work that with policy work that ASCB has done, we don't take positions on them because they're not our thing. And so therefore, by specializing, if you will, from general politics and general government to specific areas, you remove that problem of framing, right? Oh no, I just do this. It's from a policy person's perspective, one of the great things about policy at the ASCB is, in a lot of ways, the only real question is it important for our members? There is a whole bunch of issues that are not important to cell biologists as a profession, and I don't have to worry about it.
Gotcha. So it's about staying in the lane that
absolutely
you're serving. Yep. Great. Okay. I'll have one last question, and unless any of our attendees would like to type a question in the chat box, but I'm wondering, as scientists, is there anything we can do, whether we're trainees or already independently employed, that would kind of enhance our own ability to get involved in advocacy? Or is our science training, pretty much what we need to focus on for that? Or what are your thoughts?
So the only real issue is that by the time you're a graduate student or a postdoc or then have moved on, scientists know too much for the general public. The general public doesn't need to know the minutiae that are important to cell biologists. They also don't need to know it in the language that cell biologists use. So the most important thing is to figure out how to explain science, and particularly your science, in an easily understandable fashion. And that's the most important thing, because if you were to pick up an abstract and read that to somebody, if you were to read it to me, I would have no idea what it meant. The first challenge for anyone that's going to do any kind of advocacy is you have to be able to explain it to me in a way that I can understand, and in a way that matters to me. What is it that your work that you do in your lab? And if, answer this question, these two questions: what do I do? And then the most important thing is, if successful, the work being done in my field, in my lab, will result in, and fill in the blank. Because while it's important to a scientist what's being done in a lab, the public really wants to know what the outcome is going to be. And then if you can impress them with that outcome, if they can buy into it about what might happen, then you've got them hooked. That's essentially was what the whole human embryonic stem cell debate was about, right? It was, if successful, if the federal government allows federal funding to be used for embryonic stem cell research, one day it might result in a whole set of areas of science. And in a sense, what we asked the US government to do is to buy into that promise, to buy into that potential. And they did. That's why it's such a great science policy issue. It's a perfect example. But that's what you have to be able to do. I have to understand what it is you're talking about. And then you have to get me to be almost emotionally involved in it. I need to understand what you're doing and be hopeful for you. And that's also why I think having people see what a lab looks like, I think that's an important first step. It's either, they either think it's CSI or, an old Frankenstein movie, the lab there, but I don't think they really understand.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And it's good in a sense to know, because that's a skill scientists need, or any professional needs anyway. Whether we want to be involved in advocacy or not, we always need to be able to explain what we do to a lay audience, whether it's in writing or, presenting or grants or anything like that. So it's good to know.
Because partly I'd argue that anytime you talk to a lay audience, that's advocacy.
Ah, okay. Gotcha. Okay.
It's not, advocacy, and that's the thing. Everybody thinks advocacy is going to Capitol Hill or talking to an elected official. That's not good enough anymore. So anytime you're going to, even at a dinner party, and you can get someone interested, and you can convince them, you've done advocacy.
Gotcha. We have another question for you, Kevin. How do you convince committees, for example, when applying for a job, that the time you spend on advocacy is a good thing and not a waste of time away from your research?
Yeah, no, you're right. That's the problem. And I think that I think that it has to start at the top, honestly. I also think that in some ways that we may have to almost jump a generation, and so I'm kind of as interested in reaching out to tomorrow's PIs and to convince them that it's important. So when they get a lab, it will be important to them, and they'll pass it down to that third generation. But I understand the pressures and the challenges of, just focus on the research. I understand that. And I also understand that when I said in the presentation that it's the responsibility of the senior scientists to impart show by example, I understand that not everyone's going to agree with me on that, but it has to. Unless you're lucky enough, to be, funded, unless you're lucky enough not to be funded in part or in whole through a federal agency, you have a responsibility. And I also understand that not everyone's going to agree with me on that. I don't have a good answer for you there. I really don't. Other than to try to do it and remember that when you have your lab, to pass it down.
Right. Understandable. I mean, I guess we can just try to hope that, scientists as a whole in academia or wherever appreciate the value that the public needs to understand what we're doing. We need to understand their perspective, and this all ties into our whole ecosystem functioning. Yep. So I guess it can be a lofty case to make, I suppose. Okay. Well, I don't believe we have any more questions coming from our audience here. So if that's the case, then we would like to thank you, Kevin, for sharing your perspective and your advice and your overview. I think it was really helpful to see all the different ways and levels in which we can get involved in advocacy. It made me more hopeful that even I can go to a party and, talk about my science there, and I don't necessarily need to do a full-time advocacy job. So I think this is great ways of that everyone can be involved in this really important issue.